Mr. Waller, Mr. Price, members of the council, guests and friends, it's my enormous pleasure to welcome you to the 20th Annual Baltimore Sun Foreign Policy Panel. Can you hear now? You've just been welcomed. Let me thank the Sun not only for the panel, but for being the sponsor of this evening's reception and the cable TV rebroadcast of this program. We're enormously appreciative of that. And in the interest of time, I'll resist the temptation to expand on the fact that this is the 20th of these foreign policy panels. We certainly have covered a lot of interesting time from the end of the Carter administration to something close to the end of the Clinton administration, with the Bush and Reagan years sandwiched in between. And we've made a transition from thinking that we were going to spend the rest of our lives within the context of a Cold War to have it end and have the world look very, very different to us today. And we stand here wondering a little bit about just what the American foreign policy will end up being in this post-Cold War era, and with some curiosity about the people who seek the leadership of that foreign policy in the near future. But the panel will speak to those wonderfully interesting questions. This evening's session is an hour and a half in order to give ample time for the panelists to participate fully. The panel will be introduced by Jeff Price, who's the foreign editor of the Baltimore Sun. Jeff has been with the Sun for over 30 years. He did what a lot of people do, serving as a Metro reporter. He's been a member of the editorial staff, and spent over half his time in foreign affairs. He was twice the correspondent to the Middle East, in 72 to 75, and I think 82 to 87, 2 tours. And in 1991 was named the foreign editor of the Sun. We look forward to a splendid evening. We thank the Sun very much. I would be remiss if in thanking the Sun again, I didn't also thank Joe Stern, who for 18 years chaired and organized this panel. The panel tonight is organized and made possible largely through the efforts of Jeff Price. It's my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Jeff Price.
Can you hear me? No, I knew that. Closer. Can you hear me now? I'm not sure that I can hang over this thing like this all night, but I wanted to say a little bit more about Joe Stern, because of all the acts I've had to follow, this has been one of the hardest. And he did this for 18 years, started it 20 years ago, made our editorial page one of the best editorial pages in the country. And I'm just really talking to Joe Stern, so it doesn't matter. But you should all know that I was saying very nice things about him, and saying basically that following his act in any respect would be difficult, but following it and trying to organize this Council on Foreign Affairs annual affair has been among the more difficult. I'm glad that he is sitting in the front row, and I'm also glad that Dan Berger agreed, as I asked him to do, to sit in the front row, because if Dan has any tough questions that we can't answer, he can answer them himself. And if any of you have any tough questions that we can't answer, he can answer them himself. He has been on this panel before and very graciously agreed to give his place to one of the correspondents, since we have more correspondents at this particular affair this year than we've ever had before. thank you, Dan, too. I wanted to try to do, I think most of you have been at these affairs before, and we felt that some of the comments by the correspondents were going a little bit too long, and that we were, as a result of that, not having enough time for questions and answers from the audience, which we think is probably the most important and interesting part of the whole program. So I'm running on the assumption that we have as many people as we usually do who have questions, and where the correspondence comments are going to be shorter than they have in the past, and I'm hoping that we can get people to come up and sort of participate in the discussion at these, there are 2 microphones here, and make this a little bit more of a discussion than a bilateral exchange. Is that right, Joe? Frank Bird asked me if I would make some comments in the beginning on the Clinton foreign policy and what we may have to look forward to with respect to the foreign policy of the future, the candidates who are now running. I want to sort of adapt that a little to one of my favorite subjects, which is basically a little bit of a discussion, some ideas that I've developed over the successes and failures, or when I say failures, I think more in terms of missed opportunities of the last decade, which would take us from the end of the Cold War and include a couple of years of the Bush presidency. I think that successes, the best ones that come to mind, are Ireland and the Middle East, especially if you think about the state of the relationship between the adversaries in those 2 places, each of them 30 years ago. And of course, developments lately in the relationship in those 2 areas demonstrate that no matter how hard we try to bring about progress, ultimately it depends on the adversaries themselves wanting to go along. But especially in the Middle East, I think we have an excellent example of the fact that U.S. influence brought to bear consistently for a prolonged period for a good cause, really for as long as it takes, that it can work. And if you just recall what the state of affairs was in 1967 in the Middle East, when we really first began to get very aggressively involved in the peace process there, and compare it to where we are now, I think that it's obvious how important and really constructive and good our participation and our aggressive participation in that process has been. Some other examples of our conduct abroad are less encouraging because they don't really reflect the same sort of patient, prescient, thoughtful, imaginative, and constructive contribution that we've persisted in making in the Middle East. These are what I view as some sort of missed opportunities, the sort of situations that make you wonder sometimes, what if? Closest to home is the experience that we've had in Haiti and the experience that we've brought to the Haitians since the 1994 occupation of Haiti, when I think we had an opportunity to really bring a fairly high moral standard to an adventure in our own backyard. I think that if we had done it right, we probably would have occupied the country in more constructive ways, would have made a greater contribution to the infrastructure of the country, to its economy, would have, okay, I realize that you have to train a police force and that there were other things that needed to be straightened out. I think it probably would have been a better idea to leave Aristide behind, tell him that we would let him know when it was time for him to come, and if that took 10 years, fine. As it is now, seems to me that we have, can you hear me when I sit back? No. Okay. Okay. As it seems now, when we've left the place, we had 20,000 troops there in 1994 when we occupied the country. We've left a situation that really is not any better. It may be worse in many ways than it was when we first arrived. Democracy is no more a reality there now than it was before. Preval, the president, has dismissed the parliament, and I think that we really missed an opportunity to do something in our own backyard and demonstrate not only to our own hemisphere but to the rest of the world that we can be constructively engaged. There are some other what ifs, and one of the ones that always comes to my mind is what if somebody seriously had told Saddam Hussein what would happen to him in 1990 if he invaded Iraq, and what a difference that might have made. Another opportunity that I think we missed if we had people, and we always have people, especially on station, who have a very good idea of what people are saying, what they mean when they're saying this, so that if we'd had somebody 10 years ago who had understood what Milosevic meant when he made his speech in Kosovo, and what this meant for the worst sort of nationalist tendencies that were going to start to manifest themselves in Yugoslavia, if the President of the United States had been alerted to the need to call this man and to maybe show him some pictures of Baghdad and let him know what might happen if he were to go ahead with the sorts of plans that he had in mind, we might have averted Bosnia, we might have averted Kosovo and saved us a lot of money and saved a lot of lives more important than that. Cuba is another place where I think, especially in our own hemisphere, there have been so many missed opportunities in Cuba that they are probably more than we know. I think that Cuba represents one of the great hypocrisies in our foreign policy, especially when you compare it to China and how we are actively and supposedly constructively engaged with the largest and, to my mind, far more repressive communist regime than the one that exists in Cuba. But we are not engaged with the Cubans, and there's one big reason for that. We all know what it is, and it's led to one of the most, right these days, has led to one of the most embarrassing, humiliating experiences that I've ever seen in any relationship with any country, where we have a 6-year-old boy basically being hurled around on the trampoline of this dispute that won't go away. My hope for the forthcoming decade is that we finally get a president who has the courage to tell the militant Cuban-American community in Dade County, and I'm a native of Dade County, so I know something about these people, that the entire United States will not be held hostage to their position any longer. That lobby is not the only one that skewers our foreign policy. Should we take account on that? Well, let's see if you keep on clapping, because my own view is that that lobby is not the only one which skews American foreign policy at times, but it has certainly skewered it for too long. This brings me to a final point. There is reason for the inordinate, sometimes counterproductive influence that lobbies like the Cuban Americans, or the Israeli Americans, or the Greek Americans have on our policy. They are primarily single-issue lobbies, well-funded, well-organized, extremely well-briefed on the positions that they advance. If the American population as a whole would take even a small amount of the time that these intensive lobbies take to think and care about where they would like America to be in the world and how important the forthcoming decade will be in deciding that, we might encourage a leadership that will act more thoughtfully, more futuristically, rather than react often when it's too late. I'd like to borrow a phrase from an article that I read by Richard Haas a couple of months ago, in which he argued that the message to the next president ought to be, "It's the world, dummy." Thank you. Now, I'm going to go from left to right here, and I think that's Mark Matthews over there, our Middle East correspondent. We're going to try to go and make some points in a fairly rapid fashion about what we think the most important things, most important events have been in their regions, each of their regions in the last year, what we're looking at in the forthcoming year, and what the impact of all this may be on America and what the impact of America may be on them. So Mark, would you give us your ideas of what we have to look forward to?
Thank you, Jeff. We're coming up. Spin it around. It's hard to imagine we're coming close to the 10th year anniversary of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. This also is 9 years since the revival of the Middle East peace process under President Bush. 6 years since the Oslo agreements, and now in many ways it's crunch time, and the crunch is very much landing on Prime Minister Ehud Barak of Israel, who came into office vowing to bring about a comprehensive peace with all of Israel's surrounding neighbors. It's crunch time because what Israel and its neighbors confront now is the end of a long and very painful struggle over land and over rights. And right now, it's looking very much touch and go. It looks as though nobody wants to appear at this stage of the bargaining to be giving an inch, and the result of as we've seen in the past couple of weeks has been a little bit bloody, and it could very well escalate further before it simmers down again. I happen to believe that it will simmer down, but there are hurdles that Barak and the other leaders are going to have to get over before they can get things back on track. I spent some time in Lebanon recently, which drove home to me one of the really important questions of the region that's going to have to be solved before the whole area can remain calm, and that is the question of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees scattered throughout the Middle East, but concentrated in the West Bank, Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. They are part of the problem of Lebanon, but certainly not the only one. There is an active guerrilla movement that is escalating its war with Syria war with Israel along the border, with Syria's acquiescence. They don't see it in their interest to calm down, and right now there is a test of wills between Barak and President Assad of Syria. I think neither of them wants to appear to be in any way rushing or in any way intimidated. And Assad is very sensitive to the idea that he may be viewed as old and sick, and so he's determined to show that he can outweigh the... President Assad of Syria seems to be determined to show that he can outweigh the other guy. While that set of negotiations is at a complete stalemate now, the Palestinians and the Israelis are likewise stalled. The Palestinians were afraid that they'd be the odd man out, and I think they've learned something from the Syrians, which is that if things aren't going your way, it's best to bring the whole process to a halt and see if maybe the Americans can bring pressure on the other side. Over the next months, towards the end of the year, I certainly can't predict beyond that. I think we're likely to see a little more violence, some real tension on the Israeli-Palestinian front, particularly over Jerusalem and over the status of East Jerusalem. And with any luck and with sufficient American presence and pressure on all sides, it is possible. There is a ever slimmer hope, but there is a hope that there could in fact be at least the outlines of a comprehensive peace before Bill Clinton leaves office. Thank you.
Mark, let me ask you something. On this, with Barack sort of dealing on two fronts between as between the Israelis and the Palestinians and the Israelis and the Syrians, does that give him any more leverage? I mean, is he in a position where he can get so far with the Palestinians and then say, okay, I'm not going to talk to you guys anymore, and call Washington and say, let's go with the Syrians for a while? Or
I think he's tried that, and I think he's found that it doesn't work. And it really could only work up to a point. And having those two going at once presents an added problem. He knows, the Israeli people know, and the Americans know that to strike a deal with Syria, he has to give up practically all of the Golan Heights, if not. Barack knows that in order to strike a deal with Syria, he's got to give up the Golan Heights. The Israeli people can look ahead and see their country shrinking. And when they look at the Palestinian track, it's the same deal. It's land for peace, which means what they now consider to be Israel is going to get smaller still. So there are ferocious pressures on Barack, both from the Golan Heights community and from the settler community in the West Bank. And these pressures are coming at the same time, and it makes it very difficult for him to make a concession on one side and hold firm on the other.
well, Kathy Lally, who sits on Mark Matthews' right, is our Moscow correspondent. She covers a country that's much different than it was when she first got there in 1991, right?
I had 2 years off, hopefully for good behavior.
And, well, as an aside, a country that used to be very deeply involved in the Middle East process but hasn't been able to get back in since Kissinger knocked them out about 25 years ago. So tell us what's going on in Russia these days.
Well, first I'd like to tell you something about the way the ordinary Russian views the world. Last fall, a Russian friend and I, Liana, went to Red Square to meet a British correspondent who was leaving. He worked for the Independent, and he was actually going to the Middle East. And he wanted to say farewell to Lenin, who was still on Red Square. As we waited in the line, and actually, unusually, there was a long line because there were rumors that Lenin was going to be buried. These rumors have come and gone, but new rumors that Lenin was going to be buried. So many Russians from the provinces who were vacationing in Moscow had come to say farewell. So as we waited in the line, we heard the announcements that you couldn't take any cameras in. And I said to Phil, "You don't have a camera, do you?" He said, "No, but I have a cell phone." I said, "Do you have your license?" He said, "What do you mean a license? I got this phone in London. You don't have to have a license." And I said, "Well, you know, if you get one here, you know you have to have a license." So we debated what to do about it. And finally, Liana said, "Well, I'll put it in my purse because if they find it, it will be easier." She's a Russian colleague of ours. She said, "If they find it, it will be easier for me to argue my way out of it than for either of you." So we said, okay. We get up to the head of the line. They searched us. They found the phone. in her purse, plucked it out, and this very, very large policeman said to a rather small Leanna, "Where's your license?" She said, "It's in the office because, you know, several people use it, so we don't all take the license." "You have to have a license," he said. "Give me your passport. Show me your documents." He looked for a long time at her passport as if he were memorizing her name and address and said, "Yelena Georgievna, I'm going to have to take you to the police station. It'll take 3 or 4 hours. We'll have to write a protocol, which is an official version of what happened, which is never favorable to the accused. And then you'll have to pay a fine of 1,500 rubles, which was at the time was about $60. Of course, she was terrified of going to the police station because once you go there, you never know when you're going to actually get out again. So she looked up at him and she said, "Can I pay the fine here?" He looked at her and he said, "Yelena Georgievna, do you realize you're offering me a bribe?" She looked at him and said, "Yes." He said, "Oh, okay, well, how much do you want to pay?" She said, "I think a third would do." He said, "Okay, that sounds good, 500 rubles. And she said, "Well, technically, how do we do this?" He said, "I'll give you back your passport. You put the money in your passport. You give it to this young man next to me." He had 2 young policemen in training, learning how to solicit bribes and how to make sure that no one reports you because you're in on it. So she said, "Okay, well, I'm going to have to ask him for the money." And she pointed over to Phil. Phil and I were standing a little ways away. We had been cleared to go in. And the policeman looked over at Phil and said, "Is he going to object to this?" And she said, "No, he'll be fine." The policeman said, "How long has he been here?" She said, 4 years. He said, "Understood." She came over to us. Phil gave her the money. She put it in the passport. Passport came back empty. Phone came back. Off we went to see Lenin. And this all occurred in front of maybe 100 people and right in the shadow of the Kremlin next to Boris Yeltsin, the president at the time, next to his office. So this is the kind of thing that Russians have to put up with every day. So what their leaders are doing on policy issues is often something remote and even rather meaningless to them. They have little faith in their leaders. From time to time, their leaders use foreign policy issues to stoke up sentiment for one goal or another. Certainly that was true during the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia. And there's sort of a, that's kind of short-lived though, usually. There's kind of a feeling among Russians that the United States has become somewhat bossy since it's not checked by a powerful Russia or a powerful Soviet Union. They don't like feeling that they've been greatly diminished in the eyes of the rest of the world. They don't like the feeling that the way they see it, that the U.S. wants to run everything, you know, doesn't care about their feelings about NATO, doesn't care about their feelings about Kosovo. So all these sentiments rise up from time to time, but basically they're worried about when the policeman is going to stop them next, when they're going to have to pay their next bribe, how they're going to keep their job, and whether their vegetables are going to grow over the summer. Thank you.
The way I'd like to change this a little bit is that if you have questions that come to your mind while a speaker is speaking, then we'd like you to come up and bring you in as part of the discussion. But one of the things I'd like to ask Kathy is, what has it been like trying to cover the war in Chechnya from Moscow, where basically everybody is discouraged with some rather dire consequences from going to actually see what's really happening there.
It's been very difficult. When it first started, it was pretty impossible to go there because, even to go to the neighboring regions because the threat of kidnapping was pretty strong. And then after that, the Russians began shepherding reporters around. So if you go there now, you're in their hands. They tell you what you can see, and you can still see quite a lot, but it's really difficult to report firsthand. But it's still pretty apparent what's happening there from refugees who come to Moscow, and from some officials who have been there who are willing to speak pretty objectively about what they've seen, and it's a pretty I don't know. At first, the Russians tried to compare it to U.S. intervention in Kosovo, but since then they've become more like the Serbs than NATO. They've been completely indiscriminate in the destruction. Old people are driven out of their homes. They're killed in the crossfire. Young people are. There are many people living out in tents outside the borders of Chechnya. There's been little regard for the welfare of civilians. And now, even more sinister, they're apparently trying to send a message that if any correspondent goes there outside of their restrictions, that you don't know what's going to happen to you, because you may have been reading about the case of Andrei Babitsky, the Radio Liberty reporter, who left Grozny January 15th saying he was heading back to Russia, never arrived. Several days later, the Russians denied for several days that they had him. Finally, they admitted that they did. They said they were investigating him for helping, basically they were investigating him as a spy because he had been behind the Chechen lines reporting. And then, in something that was incredible to believe, they said that he had agreed to be exchanged for some Russian prisoners, Russian soldiers being held hostage, and showed this videotape of Babitsky being handed over to a man in camouflage with a mask covering his face, so claiming that this man who pulled him away was a Chechen commander, and the Chechens denied it, and they had really no reason to deny it. So many people think he's dead now, and that this is a signal to stay out of there if you want to stay alive.
Thank you. We're going to go to Frank Langfitt, who works in one of the other great open societies in China.
That's a great introduction, actually, for the anecdote that I'd like to share with you. Thank you. I'll speak up. Last year, the People's Republic celebrated its 50th anniversary, and it held a huge parade on the Avenue of Eternal Peace, which leads right down to Tiananmen Square. So I decided a day before the parade to walk the parade route and talk to people, shop owners, people in their homes, about how they were going to spend this great day. And this would be the equivalent of the 4th of July, 1976. And so as I walked along the alleys, I chatted with people, and I said, what will you be doing? And these were people whose homes were literally 50, 75 feet from the curb of where the parade was going to come right by. And they said, well, we'll be sitting at home watching on national television because there will be policemen outside of our homes, and we will be under house arrest all day and all night long. And I tried to explain that in the West and many other countries that are not China, that people, actually the public is actually invited to parades. And people found that as a fascinating concept. And the reason that the government did not want people coming to that parade is because they are frightened. They are frightened of their own people. They were afraid that someone might protest. And it had been a year, this to me was a metaphor really for the Communist Party at the end of the 20th century, which is a huge colossus that is really frightened of just about anybody. And during the year, this theme sort of continued. It began in April when the leaders in Zhongnanhai, which is the leadership compound right next to the Forbidden City, woke up to find 10,000 members of Falun Gong, the spiritual meditation sect, sitting outside of their front door in a lotus position, protesting. And as the year went on, I think there were more events that really emphasized to the party how little power it had. Of course, in May, as no one could have predicted, NATO bombed the embassy in Belgrade. And even as the regime encouraged people to go down and retaliate against the US embassy, I think there was a general feeling that there wasn't really much China could do because of the United States' unparalleled power around the world. And then later in the summer, Li Denghui scrapped the One China policy and said that the two sides should negotiate as equals, and essentially sent a message that Taiwan was continuing to move towards independence. So it was a very bad spring and summer for anybody on the Politburo. The one bright spot was WTO in the fall, which I think many people think will be helpful. I think as we look towards the coming year, we have the Taiwanese elections coming up next month on the 18th. My understanding is through diplomatic channels, Beijing is essentially saying that as long as the presidential candidates, whoever wins, does not reiterate Li's policy, they can get back to the negotiating table and there won't be any sort of military action. There are a couple things that I would emphasize to look for next year as well that I think are somewhat intangible. One is, I think it's worth watching Falun Gong. I think that this group, the Communist Party has not heard the last of this group. They are true believers, and they may do something dramatic. I have no evidence of that, but I think that many of us correspondents in the European and the US press corps wonder about that. And another thing, which is sort of lurking beneath the surface and is really a great threat to the regime, is the internet. Last year, internet usership more than quadrupled in China. It went from 2 million to 9 million. The actual number of users is far beyond that. I don't have a friend between 22 and 35 in China who's Chinese, who's not online. And more Chinese now have more access to more information than at any other time in their history. And I think that this is a great, the regime is very worried about this, and they probably should be. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. We're going to move to Bill Glauber now, who's our London correspondent, sometimes nominally the London correspondent because he spends a lot of time in other parts of the world, including last year when he spent the better part of 4 months in Yugoslavia, most of it in Belgrade, where he was having the product of our arms manufacturers being dropped very nearby, and having a rather scary time. So he'll tell us about that and a few other things.
Well, since we last met, last year I talked about the euro, and it was supposed to be the strong currency, and it's now weak. Europe is now 17% off. The legendary leader of German reunification, Helmut Kohl, is enmeshed in a tremendous financial scandal that begs the question, is the big man about to go to the big house? The air war that was supposed to take 2 or 3 days to convince Yugoslav President Slobodan Milosevic to get his troops out of Kosovo dragged on for 10 weeks, resulted in about 500,000 people being rendered homeless, and nearly fractured the Western alliance. So as you can see, state-old Europe can offer some surprises, and there will probably be more surprises this year that are sort of beyond our comprehension and scope right now. But here's 5 things to look for. Northern Ireland. The recent news that the province's fledgling government is suspended and the IRA has pulled out of disarmament talks is grim. But you have to look at some bright spots because there are many. The gunmen are silent, business is improving, and the strong ties between the Roman Catholic community and the Protestant community are improving. And in Northern Ireland, you can never say never, and you can never believe in any deadline because there's always another deadline. And recent years there have shown that politicians of faith, acting in good faith, have done some amazing things. So I would be optimistic that they will find a way out of the latest dead end. Second area, German Incorporated. The Vodafone takeover or merger with management is really the tip of the iceberg. They're going to be changing their capital gains laws, and it could be open season on German firms. The third area, the 35-hour work week in Paris. We make fun of this, but actually, in a strange way, this edict may make French business less rigid, more open to change. And you may note that the unemployment rate is dropping from about mid-12 to about mid-10. So you should take a look at France. It is the world's fourth largest economy, and often we forget that. The other area, the European Union and that new pariah state of 8 million skiers, Austria. Many critics of the EU's policy to try to freeze out Austria think that, how can we help a country with a xenophobic anti-immigrant party? Hey, let's tell them what to do. And others believe that the EU is showing a moral backbone and that this is a necessary thing. My only suggestion would be to Jörg Haider, he could do without the black shirts. I think the guy could end up chancellor within 2 years. I don't think he is as dangerous as he's been portrayed. I think that, an anti-immigrant, anti-EU expansionist, he sounds like a mainstream Tory to me. And I'm not trying to belittle some of his more extreme remarks, but it does seem to be an overreaction. And the fifth area is Yugoslavia. In Belgrade, apparently it's not safe to be a gangster or a criminal. Some of them seem to be having collisions with bullets. But somehow President Slobodan Milosevic, who some say is both a gangster and a criminal, survives. I wouldn't expect that he would go anywhere this year. However, there will be more democracy demonstrations in the spring. And in Kosovo, well, that means quagmire for the US and its allies, because they're now overseeing a land where the oppressed are now the oppressors, and the oppressors are now the oppressed. And I have 3 boys, ages 3, 6, and 9, and I am quite convinced that all 3, if they so chose, would be able to serve in a peacekeeping force in that part of the world. Thank you very much.
You know, every morning at about 11 o'clock, they give me the what we call the layout pages for the foreign section, telling me how much space I have for foreign stories. And it's never enough space for all the stories that we would like to get into, even pretend that we're trying to cover the world. Bill Glauber always makes me happy because he can tell a hell of a story in about 15 inches. Really packs it in. So we're going to go to Mr. Jay Hancock now, who's our State Department correspondent. Jay took over last year from Mark Matthews, who, when he last was on this panel, was the State Department correspondent. Jay, I hope, is going to give us some idea of what all this means for America and what America is going to do about it.
Well, I wish I knew, but I think Richard Haas is right. It is the world, stupid, and right now the world is America's oyster. I would argue that this country is in a position now on the globe that is almost unprecedented since the situation of Great Britain in between the fall of Napoleon and the rise of Metternich in the 19th century, with maybe the exception of a brief time after World War II. We are paramount economically, politically, and militarily. And the key question is, what are we going to do with that? Both in terms of how are we going to use that position for good and furthering the ideals that this country stands for, and how are we going to keep from blowing it? It's very easy to be overweening and to overreach your grasp. Kathy Lally said that the Russians believe that the Americans want to run everything. Well, the Russians aren't the only ones. Much of the world feels this way, and it will require subtlety and guile and a certain degree of good faith on our part, I think. As Jeff said, I've had the diplomatic beat for 6 months, and one of the lessons that's really been driven home to me in covering this beat is even in this age of global communication and the internet, how easily and severely we misunderstand each other among nations, how we misread other states and how they misread us. It really was quite striking to me. Anyway, in this position, here's some of the issues you're going to be reading about this year. One that may come up very soon or may be put off until June is our trading relations with China and letting China into the WTO. And this, of course, is part of the huge theme of economic engagement and the globalization of commerce. And it's not just a business issue, it's a diplomatic issue. Diplomacy these days is as much about jobs and capital flows as it is about State Department cables. It will be a tough fight in Congress. The key issue is whether or not this country will extend permanent normal trading relations towards China. A lot of people think it's a toss-up. There's an Iranian election coming up very soon that will be very important for us. The moderates, there is great hope that the moderates will make strides and that country will become more engaged in the world. Europe continues to evolve as a potential superstate, its currency notwithstanding. But if German companies do restructure, as Bill mentioned, the euro eventually may recover, and they may give us a run for our money, literally. We have a new chief of state in Kathy Lally's country, of Russia. We're still trying to figure out who this person is. We know he exhibits very diverse characteristics for Kremlin watchers. He's said to be described as everything from an ex-KGB agent and a spook to a devout Christian. And I don't think, he's probably somewhere in between, but we're not quite sure where yet. We're going to hear a lot about missile defenses this year. This has obviously been an issue for this country since the 1970s. It is a technological issue as well as a diplomatic issue. And it's going to be talked about a lot on Capitol Hill, and you're going to be reading about it if you open our pages. We're also going to you're going to hear about religious militants in Asia, continuing. As many of you know, the downing of the Egypt Air flight was a very sensitive issue for Egyptians. Many Arabs generally felt that the United States totally misconstrued that situation. And that goes along with the issue of our relations with, well, it's peripheral to the issue of the Islamic militants, but it goes along with it as well. It's another example of what I mentioned earlier of nations and states and people just really misunderstanding where the other one is coming from. But you will continue to hear about Osama bin Laden and his associates. It's a continuing security issue for this country. There's several other issues, but I think Jeff wants to get to the questions. So, and you probably more than Jeff. So why don't we do that?
Yes, we would like to get to the questions, so we'll start over here.
Good evening, panel. My name is Donald Glauber. I'm a graduate student at Morgan State University in the International Affairs Department. I also write a newspaper, a community newspaper in West Baltimore. All that to say, I highly respect your information, and I have a lot to learn from you, no doubt. But I would be remiss in my duties if I did not at least inquire in this February, this month. Dr. Carter G. Woodson did appoint as Black History Month. If I didn't ask where Africa fit into the Global 2000, as well as Latin America, if you could maybe address that for me.
Africa obviously fits in, and so does Latin America. I'm sorry if it seems as if we were ignoring Africa, and I should have probably said something about it in my own comments, since the correspondents who were here, the only correspondent who's not here is our African correspondent, who I'm sorry to tell you under these conditions is off covering the America's Cup, which may be totally irrelevant. But in any case, if he were here, I think he would have spoken very eloquently about Africa and at least the concern that you implied that it is the ignored continent. In this decade, I don't think anybody in this room or on this panel needs to be reminded that the worst genocide in terms of numbers, possibly since the Holocaust occurred in Rwanda, while nobody was paying attention. I mean, people knew what was happening, but they certainly were not doing anything to prevent it. And the impression that I have, and that a lot of people who were a lot closer to that situation than I was that if the UN commander in Kigali had been paid any attention to, or anybody had wanted to go and help, they probably could have prevented this from happening. Rwanda, I think, sort of stands as the metaphor for how ignored Africa is in many ways. Also as an example of how, if it doesn't really bother you right on your front doorstep, and this was sort of a twist on an argument that Boutros Ghali used to make, which was even harsher condemnation of how we cared a lot more about white wars and European wars than we do about African wars. And I think that the war that's going on in Congo, formerly Zaire, is a typical example of that.
One reads optimistic projections that the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians will be completed by September, and yet there seems yet another glitch in the timing and how much territory will be turned over by Israel to the Palestinians. And Arafat again is posturing to create a new state by September if the peace process is not completed. One also reads about the fact that in the peace process between Syria and Israel, the major obstacle is the Golan Heights, and the question is where the boundaries are to be drawn. And now, in recent weeks, we read about the Hezbollah and their terrorist attacks on the Israeli soldiers in Lebanon, and notwithstanding the fact that, at least purportedly, the Hezbollah is being financed by Iran, Syria is the one that calls the shots on Lebanon. And why can she control the Hezbollah? And if she can, what is her rationale in permitting them to do what they're doing? So my specific question is, what's going on, and what is your personal prognosis for the future of the processes between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and the Syrians and the Israelis?
I can address the question of Hezbollah. I believe Syria could control Hezbollah. Syria right now shows no interest in controlling Hezbollah beyond a certain point. They and Hezbollah have agreed, at least for now, that Hezbollah is not going to fire missiles into Israel. Those missiles in the past have killed civilians in the communities in north of Israel. And Hezbollah does not want, nor Syria, wants to give Israel a reason to retaliate heavily. At the same time, Hezbollah knows that it has hit a soft spot in Israel by killing soldiers. This is a country where every family has to offer up teenage sons and daughters who are to serve in the military. It's a young country with a lot of young people on the street, and the loss of them is something that the whole country feels. I gave a kind of a prognosis, a very wishy-washy one earlier, because I can't predict with any certainty that there will be a comprehensive peace by the end of the year. It looks very doubtful that there's going to be an Israeli-Palestinian peace by September. I'll be surprised if it happens. I think Syria and Israel both want to get back to the table. I think that could be solved rather quickly. Everybody knows what the issues are, and there's a basic formula out there, but they're still in a testing period, and I think to some degree Assad wants to see how much Barak can now take, because that will give him an idea of how committed Barak will be to upholding any peace that he signs.
Let me simply thank them for what I think was an absolutely wonderful evening. Gentlemen, ladies, thank you.